Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to have this conversation this evening. I had the luxury, I guess, of reading this book on a beach vacation in Mexico over the last couple of weeks, and I devoured it. Like, I absolutely tore through this thing very quickly, and it has primed me excellently for my trip to Ukraine next week. So I feel like this was a match made in heaven in a bunch of different ways. Listen, there's a whole bunch of stuff I want to talk about in this book, but I think we need to do some scene setting, because a lot of people were introduced to Volodymyr Zelensky in a real way when the war began more than 2 years ago now. But you've known him a lot longer than that. So give us a bit of an introduction to who Volodymyr Zelensky is and how he became relevant to the Ukrainian people.
Well, he was relevant and very famous for many years before he went into politics. He was, before the presidency, his generation's greatest satirist, and I'd say Ukraine's greatest showman, in the sense of, in the broadest sense imaginable, as a filmmaker, an actor, a comedian, a star of variety shows, cooking shows, reality shows, Dancing with the Stars. As a voice actor, he did Paddington Bear's voiceover in the Ukrainian version. He won, actually, Dancing with the Stars. He is also a fantastic actor, dancer. So he was all those things, and he was very famous as a showman both in Russia and Ukraine. His television productions were always in the Russian language, his native language, and he was a huge star in both countries up until the war began, really, in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and Zelensky stopped doing business with the Russians. We can talk about that later if you like. But when he went into politics, he was already extremely famous, a household name in Russia and Ukraine. And I think the idea that he would run for president was not so far-fetched because he had, 3 years before he went into politics, he had played the Ukrainian president on television. In a very funny sitcom called Servant of the People, where a high school history teacher accidentally becomes the president as a kind of write-in candidate that people just, anyway, we can get into it, but it's funny, you should watch it, it's on Netflix. So for 3 years, the Ukrainian people were watching him on television play the role of president in this comedy, so the idea of him, a president with Zelensky's face, was not so strange. And I think that TV show also primed him and the Ukrainian public to see him run.
Well, listen, we don't need to do a synopsis of the show because it is on Netflix and it's really actually good. The subtitles are great. That's my Ukrainian Duolingo keeps reminding me, not very good. But tell me a bit about that show, because he really made the decision to run for president in between the second and third seasons, and the third season ends up becoming sort of a campaign manifesto that helps sort of define who he wants to be to the Ukrainian people. Yes,
the comedy was the campaign. I mean, it was very difficult to separate them. So I arrived in early 2019 to cover the elections, and the way I pitched the story to my editors was a report on the two kind of mainstream candidates who were vying for the post, but then Zelensky kind of came out of nowhere. And the show, he continued producing the show, filming episodes of the comedy during the presidential elections. And it was the third season, the final season of the show, was released a few days before the first round of voting. So people had just enough time to binge watch the final season before heading to the polls. And the third season, as the previous seasons, depict him as this just eminently good-hearted, honest, uncorrupted, normal guy of a president who does a fantastic job of cleaning out the corrupt elites and so on. So he, it was a very convincing pitch to the Ukrainian electorate to see him play this role. That was, I'd say the primary pitch to voters.
So
was the show.
You know, the character Godobarenko, the teacher's name.
Holoborodko.
Again, my Ukrainian not great. The character he plays in this show is this sort of everyman teacher who just gets fed up with the corruption, who goes viral for recording this expletive-laden rant about all of the corrupt idiots, and then he's sort of faced with the corruption when he becomes president. How does that differ from the real Zelensky, who you got to know a fair bit before you started the book, while you were writing the book, during the war, before the war? How do you distinguish them, and at what points do they start to sort of overlap?
There was some overlap. I mean, certainly going into the presidency, one of his main promises was fighting corruption. There were two. So he said he wanted to make peace with the Russians and end the war in the Donbass, which had then been raging for about 5 years, and to fight corruption. I'd say that overlaps pretty well with the goals that the television president had in the TV show. I mean, the key difference is that on the TV show, Zelensky and his screenwriters could control the reality in that contained world, whereas once he became president, reality very much smacked him in the face very quickly. I think many people in the United States certainly got to know him for the first time a few months after he became president. He became enmeshed in the scandal that led to Donald Trump's first impeachment, where Donald Trump tried to extort favors from Zelensky, political favors, in exchange for military aid. So that was his kind of first confrontation with the ugliness, the meanness of international affairs, of politics. So I think I was spending time with him. I was sort of observing the impeachment scandal from Kyiv and from the perspective of Zelensky and his team. And for them, it was just a very painful and humiliating experience, very much unlike the world of the TV show, where things were ugly and messy, but there was a happy ending. I think reality stubbornly refuses to give him the happy ending that he had there.
You sort of paint a picture of Zelensky's initial administration as being sort of very ad hoc. Sort of picking people on a whim to sort of manage critical affairs for the Ukrainian government. And you tell the story of him trying to manage Donald Trump. Tell me a bit about that. I mean, I think it's a really nice preview of what will come when the war begins, which obviously we're going to get to in a second.
Yes, so I devote a chapter in the book to the impeachment scandal. Again, from a perspective that most Americans didn't see it. Most Americans saw it on the televised impeachment inquiry hearings, where you had all these U.S. officials coming up to testify about how Trump had tried to strong-arm the Ukrainians. I was seeing it from the Kyiv side, and yes. So when he came in, it was a very chaotic administration. People from all walks of life. A lot of Zelensky's friends from the world of entertainment. There were some people from the tech world and the tech scene in Kyiv who were just friends with Zelensky and knew him. There was also a group informally called the professionals or the reformers, who had experience governing, and they would sort of advise Zelensky on, okay, this is how an economy works, this is how international affairs works, this is how you make a phone call on the secure line phones to another world leader, this kind of thing. So there was this group of people too. But in terms of managing relations with the Americans, this one episode that I just always comes to mind when I think about the impeachment, that period. They were sitting around early on in the administration and talking about how they could get a meeting with Trump, a visit to the Oval Office. This is extremely important for any Ukrainian leader to demonstrate that under the incoming administration, relations with the Americans will be strong and solid and will improve. Zelensky needed to show this. He needed to visit Washington and have that sit down in the Oval Office. So they were talking about how to do this. And one of the people who was there was kind of a guy from the tech scene named Igor. He did kind of like talks on futurism and technology, and he did talks like this, kind of TED Talks in Kyiv. And he was a friend of Zelensky's, and they were talking about how to deal with the Americans, and Igor said, is there anyone in the administration who's sort of dealing with this problem or handling it? And they were like, not really. And Zelensky says, do you want to do it? And Igor's like, okay, yeah. And then he told me, I got to know Igor quite well, and he told me that night, after agreeing to play this fairly significant role in the administration, he goes out of the office of the president in Kyiv to his car, sits down in the car, opens his phone, and types in a search page, U.S. political system. and he starts learning from Wikipedia basically how America works. And when he told me that story, I was like, wow, you guys really didn't know what you were walking into. So that gives you a sense of the kind of naivete or inexperience that was pretty common in the administration at that time.
So we're recapping a fair bit of history here pretty quickly, but he's a massive household figure, runs for president, initially he's taken it as a joke, manages to win, beats two of the most kind of powerful political figures in Ukraine at the time. Obviously the president and then actually tell me a bit about this, because his two main rivals, Petro Poroshenko, the president, and Yulia Tymoshenko, I always screwed that up. He actually satirizes them on his show. I mean, he literally turns the existing Ukrainian system into a bit of a joke, and then he has to run against them in real life.
Yeah.
It is. It would be so unbelievable if it weren't actually true. Yes. What did that do to him and his relationship with the political system when he finally comes in?
Well, I mean, for one thing, yeah, he knew Ukrainian politics quite well because he had been satirizing every major Ukrainian politician for many years. So he knew all of them. They knew him. They generally didn't like him because he made fun of them all the time. He made fun of the people that he ran against, the two main candidates in the elections in 2019. He had been lampooning them for many years. Yulia Tymoshenko, who was the favorite to win the elections before he entered the race, he had personally impersonated her on stage over the years in drag. So it was a strange. I met her during the elections, and she kind of just had trouble getting her mind around what she was living through. She made an interesting remark that she compared it to the kind of anti-establishment figures that were emerging in many democracies around the world at the time, including Trump, but there were many in Europe too that were sort of coming in as outsiders and promising to break the system from the inside. And she kind of put him in that group. I think that is a fair parallel. I think he does fit into that kind of, you could say, anti-establishment populist politician. Once he was in office, I mean, it was an interesting transition. I remember I talked to his wife a lot about this. She, before they went into politics and also after, was a writer on his TV shows. She was a screenwriter. She wrote his jokes. And she told me how awkward it was to suddenly be in the position of power, and all of their friends were still in the world of comedy. Not all, some of them had come into politics with him, but their main comedy troupe continued to put out these satirical TV shows. And she described these fairly tense conversations that they would have about how harsh can they be in satirizing their friend who is now in this hot seat, in the seat of the president. And she was encouraging them not to hold back, not to pull punches, to keep making fun of him the way they would do with any president. But it was interesting. They found that very difficult because of he's their friend, he's their buddy. It's hard not to pull punches when you're making fun of a friend.
And very clearly when he does win, all of this sort of naivete becomes very clear. And I think the two things that you underline very clearly on Zelensky is naivete about how the system actually works. It's one thing to satirize something. It's another thing to actually function within it. And a level of arrogance. I mean, sometimes I think you could say it's confidence. Sometimes I think you can say it's foolhardiness. But how do those two things really come crashing together when he's trying to, root out corruption, make the system work, deal with Donald Trump, deal with Vladimir Putin, deal with the EU? I mean, it all comes crashing to reality pretty severely within a year and a half of him taking office.
Yeah, that's right. I'd say he's transformed over the time I've known him significantly, but there are a few character traits that have been consistent throughout his life, and extreme confidence is one of them. I think you see that in the figure that you've probably come to know as the wartime leader. He's very sure of his ability to achieve impossible things. You could call it hubris, you could call it arrogance, take your pick. I think where it really came crashing down for him was in his first confrontation with Vladimir Putin. That happened at the end of 2019. So again, his main promise upon taking office was to make peace with Putin, to end the war in the Donbass somehow in a way that would not be humiliating to the Ukrainian people. And he very quickly began preparing for some kind of a negotiation with Putin, a face-to-face meeting. He was very intent on setting up this meeting as soon as possible, largely because he felt an extreme confidence in his ability to reach Putin, to find some kind of pragmatism or humanity that he could turn in his favor, to somehow break the ice. And he was warned that he would fail. An American diplomat I talked to told him, don't get sucked in with Putin. You will not succeed. One of Zelensky's close allies, who was an expert in foreign affairs, told him the same thing. You won't manage to get anything out of the Russians. They are not willing to accept a peace that would be acceptable to most Ukrainians. Zelensky was generally offended by those kinds of that kind of advice. He said, "We have to try, and why not? I can do it. Give me a chance." And they met in Paris. They had these talks at the Élysée Palace, where the French President Emmanuel Macron was a mediator, and the German Chancellor, then German Chancellor Angela Merkel, was a mediator. And I describe in the book in some detail, it was a closed-door talks, but I talked to many people who were there. And Zelensky essentially tried to break the ice with a joke with Putin. Another thing he did is he spoke in Russian, which is not customary for those kinds of high-level negotiations. Usually every country's representative speaks in their native language, but he said he wanted to be understood. So he, as a native Russian speaker, spoke Putin's language. It didn't work. I mean, Putin was very irritable, just icy, dismissive. And coming out of that meeting, I talked to people who sort of saw Zelensky on his return. They described it as one of the lowest they've ever seen him, the most dejected. He had found the limits of his skills as a communicator that day.
In the kind of years before we wind up at the full-scale invasion, you do a really, I think, fantastic job. I'll keep juicing up the book. You do a fantastic job of sort of highlighting the sort of inflection points along the way where, whether it's Putin's machinations or Zelensky's decisions or the EU or NATO's decisions sort of inch everything towards the eventual conflict. And I think sometimes when we talk about these things, they become either a very clear binary of Vladimir Putin's a psychopath and has made this decision long ago and there was nothing that was going to stop him, or NATO was being aggressive and provoked this conflict. But of course, the reality is somewhere in between. Can you talk about a couple of those inflection points along the way that sort of set up where we found ourselves, or at least maybe hastened it or pushed it back, or ultimately brought us to where we ended up in February 2022?
Yeah, there definitely were those moments. I mean, for one thing, Zelensky's attempts to negotiate with Putin failed, so that certainly was an inflection point. At that point, once the negotiations clearly weren't going anywhere, I think both sides went to more of a war footing. But I think the main one that I discuss in a lot of detail that I think isn't sufficiently covered or understood is Zelensky's attempt to crack down on Russian propaganda inside Ukraine. And for many years, Putin's close friend in Kyiv was this gentleman named Viktor Medvedchuk, an oligarch, billionaire, member of parliament, the head of an opposition party in the Ukrainian parliament, and a close personal friend of Putin's. And he was basically the conduit for Russian influence inside Ukraine for many years. And Zelensky saw him as a major threat, not only to politically, but to Ukraine's cohesion and existence as a state, as a nation, because Russian propaganda was constantly, stirring up these kinds of divisions inside Ukrainian society. And at a certain point, I don't want to ramble on too much about this, it's in the book, but at a certain point, Zelensky decides to shut down the television channels that were owned by this politician, Medvedchuk, and that were basically the conduits for Russian propaganda into Ukraine. This made Putin extremely angry. And Putin says in some of his responses to this that basically we're going to have to, they're purging the political playing field in Ukraine, we're going to have to respond by other means. So I think that was a really important inflection point to understand, that conflict, that internal political conflict inside Ukraine between Zelensky and this Ukrainian politician who was very close to Putin, played out largely unnoticed by the people outside Ukraine. But now if you look back and trace the moments of how we got to the invasion, the crackdown on this politician, Zelensky's decision to close his TV channels, seize his party's assets and so on, came days before Russia sent troops to the border and began preparing for the invasion. So at least in terms of coincidence of timing, they were clearly linked.
And, we're going to get to the war next, but one thing that I think a lot of people often, they're out there when they're criticizing Zelensky now is, we have to listen to Putin's concerns. We have to figure out how to go to the negotiating table. He has some good points about NATO. He has some good points about Russian minority populations in Ukraine. But so much of what Zelensky did, what he ran on, what you describe in the book, the negotiations he tries to make with Putin, his effort to bridge the linguistic divide, so much of what he did, and even his effort to shut the door on a NATO membership, so much of what he did in the 2 years leading up to the invasion was about trying to manage that risk, and it didn't work.
Yeah. I think he was, it surprised me the extent to which he was willing to make concessions, to try to deal with some of Russia's demands. I mean, this is a very Zelensky thing to do. He always wants to look someone in the eye and just figure out what is your problem? What do you want from me? Let's talk this out. This is just his way of communicating. He's very direct. He wants to look his opponent in the eye and try to find some common ground. That is very typical of his style as a communicator. He failed to do that with Putin, and it's important to remember. I think it's often forgotten now, but early in the invasion, I'd say in the first 2 months or so, he was also trying very hard to set up a one-on-one meeting with Putin. He said, we need to sit down, even as the Russian forces were committing horrible atrocities, even as the war crimes were being uncovered across the occupied parts of Ukraine. Zelensky said, no, we need to set up a meeting. I need to talk to Putin. He started this invasion. He's the one who can end it, and I need to speak to him. And he was willing to make a lot of concessions that they were putting on the table. I think the biggest one was this idea of permanent neutrality, where Ukraine would forego its goal of joining the NATO alliance. Zelensky was willing to negotiate about that. That was one of Putin's main excuses for invading Ukraine in the first place, to prevent it from joining NATO. Not that NATO had any intention of accepting Ukraine anytime soon, but that was Putin's kind of paranoid excuse. And Zelensky wanted to talk about that. He was very willing to at least see if that would end the war.
So let's talk about the beginning of the war. I don't want to recap too much because, frankly, so much like this really significant chunk of this book is talking about those weeks after the invasion, and it's really riveting, fantastic stuff. But
Thank you.
but let's just try and give people a bit of a sense from your conversations with people what the atmosphere was really like, because so many people didn't believe it. Zelensky did not believe it was going to come. And there was a suspended disbelief that was broken on that morning. And there's a really interesting comment you make in the beginning where you kind of reference the fact that everyone's collective memories are really shaped by the years that have followed. And so tell me a little bit about the memories that you got from people about those initial weeks after the invasion began.
Yeah, that's true. I think one of the most fascinating parts of reporting this book, just on the memory question that you raised, was that I was often there. Many of the crucial events of the invasion, I was there as they were happening and talking to people basically in real time as they were processing and experiencing these things. That day or the next day, sometimes within hours. So I was able to speak to them and get their impressions before a kind of narrative took form in their minds and in their administration of, okay, this is how we're going to talk about this thing that happened 2 weeks ago, a month ago. It amazed me to see while reporting how quickly that happens. And often that narrative is not the same as what people were saying at the time. So it was quite gratifying to have that, but have those kind of immediate impressions. In terms of the atmosphere leading into it, yes, so Zelensky did not believe that the invasion would take the form that it did, that it would be so extreme. The Americans were warning him that this would be a full-scale invasion from multiple directions with bombardment of Kiev and other major cities with the goal of capturing or killing Zelensky. He didn't believe that it would be that extreme. The military leaders were, they also didn't expect that to be that wasn't the scenario at the front of their minds, but as military commanders, they have to prepare for that. And they were urging the political leadership, Zelensky first and foremost, to take serious measures to prepare for the possibility that it would be this full-scale invasion. So mobilization of reserves, fortifying the border, putting military equipment into position, and so on. These kinds of things. And Zelensky, as one of the generals, the top general, told me, was sort of putting political parameters around the military preparations because he didn't want to panic the public. He didn't want to give Russia an excuse to invade by sort of, okay, we bring our troops to the border, and then Russia says, aha, so you're menacing us, so we will attack you, right? He was afraid of that kind of escalation. And also fundamentally, he just didn't believe that would happen. He didn't believe that those kinds of preparations would be necessary. So leading into it, there was this kind of tension between the military commanders and the political leadership of how to prepare. When the invasion began, Ukraine was how to put it diplomatically, much less prepared than the military leadership in Kiev would have liked to be.
And even in we immediately think of Zelensky, this wartime president who has this incredible command over the narrative and his people. But Zelensky in those early hours, in those early days, was not that guy. Like, he wasn't there yet. He was still, he looked, shell-shocked. I mean, you kind of describe his early effort to kind of assuage the public, but he didn't seem to actually know what he was doing yet.
Yeah.
At what point does Zelensky start to actually figure out how to be that sort of commander?
I mean, in the first hours and days, they were improvising. Yeah. And in a sense, I just, thinking a lot about this and thinking about the position that Zelensky found himself in that morning, February 24th, 2022, there's really no resume, no life experience that can really prepare someone for something like that, to be attacked by a nuclear superpower that wants to kill you, kill your family, take over your whole country. There's no such profession that prepares you. Maybe military leaders, but not even that in terms of the diplomatic demands that are required of you. So I think anyone thrust into that position would have had to improvise and think on their feet. And that is essentially in the first days what Zelensky proved very good at. I think what the Russians were counting on is that the complexity and the intensity of the threat would short-circuit the leadership in Kiev and make them freeze up and run away. Sort of that kind of paralysis through fear was part of the Russian strategy. The Americans did the same thing with shock and awe. You remember in Iraq, you attack all at once and you just short circuit the leadership. But Zelensky was quite nimble and he proved quite flexible in his ability to take on a new persona, to sort of imagine what this role requires of him and step into that role and begin acting very decisively and very quickly, with very little preparation, analysis, or planning, but just to start firing off commands. Some of them backfired, some of them were ill-advised. Basically, none of them were based on careful consideration or data or anything like that. He just didn't have those things at his disposal at the time. He had to think fast and make fast decisions. But I think one character trait of his that served him very well was that kind of mental flexibility of changing and confidence.
Yeah.
Confidence.
Because the script says, in this scenario, the president should have fled.
Yes.
Right? The Americans were saying, please flee. Angela Merkel was calling up saying, please flee. I remember sitting on Russian Telegram channels that evening, and all the Russian Telegram propaganda channels were saying, he's already left. This helicopter's in the sky. He's already gone. Your president has fled. And then he goes up to the street and he records this video. He leaves the bunker, this old Soviet bunker, which I want to talk about in a second. But he goes up to the street to record a video. And I think a lot of people will say, like, this is the moment that this sort of Zelensky emerges. Can you just tell me a bit about that video?
Yeah, that video was intended to push back on the Russian propaganda. This was part of the Russian strategy to, again, break down Ukrainian leadership by pumping out this disinformation that the state has already fled. Your leader has fled, he's gone. That makes other people further down the chain of command begin to wonder, hey, maybe I should get out of Dodge as well. So Zelensky needed very quickly to counter that, and he did that by stepping out into a very recognizable square right in front of the presidential compound, a street that any Ukrainian would recognize, and just doing a selfie video with a few of his top lieutenants, and saying, we are not going anywhere, we are here. And I think that sent a very strong signal to, most importantly, I think the hierarchy of the Ukrainian state. That the boss is stuck around, so it's not time to flee yet. Like we're still fighting, we're still here. And I think it also sent a very important signal to the West that there is someone there to support. There's someone to get behind. And very quickly he stepped into the role, as he put it to me in one of our interviews. He gave himself this kind of pep talk where he said, you are now a symbol of the state, a symbol of this resistance, and you need to act the way a head of state must act. He's kind of pumping himself up to take on this new role, and he did step into it very, very nimbly, and I think the first time we saw him doing that was in that video.
Tell me a bit about Zelensky and the bunker. I mean, the bunker is this old Soviet-era bunker that, to read it, doesn't sound like a really wonderful place, but later on you talk about some of these officials kind of pining back for the days when they were working out of this bunker. How does Zelensky situate into this quite dour, Cold War bunker underneath the presidential palace?
Well, there were a few dozen officials living there with him. So on the first day, the security guards told him that there is an imminent threat of aerial bombardment of the presidential compound. We need to go down into the bunker. And from that first day, around noon, they went down there and they seldom emerged for about 6 weeks, something like that. So for that period, they were living down there. More people would arrive to kind of help manage all the tasks that were coming at them from and emergencies and threats that were coming at them. But they were all living there together, and it was, as I talked to many people who lived down there with him, not a comfortable place. They slept very little. The food was bad, or there wasn't a lot of it. It was very uncomfortable. It was very cramped. But many of them do think back now to the sense of camaraderie and purpose that they felt. One of Zelensky's aides described it as feeling like a submarine in enemy waters, which you have to imagine that the situation they were in, it imbues everything you're doing with this importance, this gravity. Whether it's writing a press release or whatever, or organizing a shipment of bulletproof vests for some military volunteers, whatever task you're undertaking has this enormous significance. And that, I think, is something that they miss. Also the adrenaline. But Zelensky talked about this in his first press conference of the invasion. He gave this press conference almost exactly 1 week after the invasion started. And at the end of the press conference, a journalist asked him, "How are you holding up, Mr. President?" And he went on this very surprising little kind of speech where he says, "My life," he said, "my life is beautiful right now. I feel that I'm needed." And then he described that the purpose of any life is to find that your life is useful to others. And certainly you can imagine, despite all the threats that he was facing, despite all the horrors he was seeing, he was in a position of pretty unique influence, significance, power, he was driving history. He was in the driver's seat of history. And I think that was very gratifying to him and something that he, I have to say, he said enjoyed.
Just FYI, we're going to go to questions in about 10 minutes, so sit and stew on it now because I'm sure there will be some fierce competition and a lot of demand. One of the most intriguing relationships that Zelensky builds is with Volodymyr Zelensky, the head of the Ukrainian military. In your book, the relationship is still very live. It's only after the book came out that it finally kind of came to fruition. It was announced, I think, today that Volodymyr Zelensky will be the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK. Walk me through just the synopsis of this relationship and how it sort of reflects Zelensky's view of his own role in this war.
Yeah, that's right. I'd say there are two relationships that are really at the center of the book and that I follow throughout the book. One is the relationship between the president and the first lady. I spent a lot of time talking to her, and we sort of see his evolution in many ways through her evolution and through her eyes. The other relationship is the relationship between the president and his top military commander, General Volodymyr Zelensky. And I describe sort of how they met, who they are. I talked extensively with General Zelensky as well for the book. And I guess to summarize it, Zelensky, early in his presidency, before the invasion, didn't show a great deal of interest in military affairs. He left it up to the generals, and the general, Zelensky, was very comfortable with that. He thought that is the way things should be. The professionals should run the military. When the invasion started, that remained the case for some time, some weeks, I would say, where Zelensky was in constant contact with General Zelensky and getting updates from him and other generals. But his responses, the president's responses to them was, what can we do? What can I do? What can I get you? How can I help you? How can I support you? He left the decisions, strategic, tactical decisions, up to them. But what you see over time is President Zelensky grows more and more confident in his own abilities and understanding of military strategy, and he develops a vision of how to fight this war, right down to the details of when to attack, and how to use military resources. And some of those priorities were not always aligned with those of General Zelensky. So they began to clash behind the scenes on questions of pretty important military strategy in terms of how to push the Russians out. And that was simmering under the surface for months. I mean, General Zelensky was finally dismissed from his post, I think in February, a couple of weeks after the book was published. But if anything surprised me about that, it was how long it took for Zelensky to finally make that decision, because the tensions between them were quite serious and quite distracting for the leadership. It's not a good thing when you have the two most powerful men in the country at a time of war disagreeing so fulsomely.
So I'll answer two more things before we move to questions, and they're both kind of future casting. Let's start with the war. There's a new commander in charge. Things have been quite dire. The summer counteroffensive didn't go according to plan. Aids being held up in Congress, and Zelensky's charm doesn't seem to be having much of an impact on Republicans there. Things are tough. Things are really tough right now. From your conversations, where do the next few months go for Ukraine? And where do the next few years go, for that matter?
It's tough. Yeah, that's generally territory, and you might notice this in the book. I don't. Prognostication is really. I don't see it as my job. It's something for analysts. But I can tell you what Zelensky has cooking that is kind of long-term strategy, and that we are already seeing play out. So yes, in the fall of last year, General Zelensky, when he was still Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, declared that on the front lines in the ground war there is a stalemate, that neither side can make fundamental progress, that they're stuck. And there needs to be some, as he put it, technological breakthrough on the order of the invention of gunpowder, as he put it, in order for something to really change on the front lines, because both sides were just dug in, stalemate. So that was kind of a low point in terms of morale for the people of Ukraine, also for the president's office. It was very difficult for them to adjust to that new reality. Now they have begun to develop ways to do that. One thing that's important to watch as you watch this war, and maybe it's kind of underreported, it gets some attention, but I think not enough, is Ukraine's attempts to increase its own domestic weapons production. That will be a really decisive and important decisive factor in how this war plays out. The Ukrainians are investing very heavily and seeking a lot of support from the West, not only in terms of ready weapon systems delivered to Ukraine, but blueprints, basically, designs. So give us the blueprints, we'll make it ourselves. This is increasingly a request that Zelensky is making of President Biden and other foreign leaders. Help us build this stuff so that you don't have to keep sending us these shipments. If you're tired of buying weapons for us, help us build them. It's a huge task. They are way behind the Russians. The Russian war machine is much stronger, much bigger, much wealthier. But they have had a lot of success in things like drones. I'm sure you've been seeing and reading about the drone strikes, and this is a kind of weapon that Zelensky likes also because it really has a dramatic effect. These drone strikes, you see these things on the news. So these images in the darkness of a Russian warship sinking or blowing up, or a Russian oil terminal somewhere near St. Petersburg exploding in the middle of the night. These are big dramatic attacks. And these are the kinds of things that I think we're going to continue seeing more of as Ukraine develops more of these kinds of what I think of as over-the-top weapons. So you have a frozen front line, but they're lobbing these missiles and drones over the top to try to hit far behind enemy lines.
Well, and it should be lost on nobody that the Showman is using weapons that have cameras mounted to them.
Right. That is important to him, and that is very important. I mean, it's been important in his military strategy throughout. He always wants, if there's one kind of consistent thing about the way he executes this war, he wants demonstrative victories. He wants something that he can show his people and all of us and Western leaders that, look, we are still fighting, we are still winning. That battleship just sank, right? So we're still in the fight. We're still having success. So he needs that, and I think it's not just about the fact that it looks good on television for the Ukrainians. It does increase morale. It preserves morale, and it tries to convince the world, at least, that Ukraine is still in this fight and still needs support and is still hurting the Russians, making the Russians bleed.
All right, last thing, and then we're really going to questions. What comes next for Zelensky politically? Again, you don't want to forecast too much. That's all right, because it's already been in the works for quite some time. I mean, he was sort of anxious about the upcoming elections before the war began. We don't know when they're going to happen now. There's a lot of speculation that his dismissal of Zelensky was in part because he was worried about a rival more popular than he is. We think of Zelensky as being sort of invincible, but that's not quite the case, is it?
Well, his popularity has been declining, definitely from a high in March 2022 of upwards of 90% trust and approval. Now it's in the neighborhood of, depending on the poll, 60 to 70%. So a steep decline, but still extremely popular. And generally, I think his standing among the Ukrainian people is too often discounted. In the West, I think he is still by far the most trusted, respected, and revered political leader in the country. If elections were held now, he would win handily. So I think we've definitely we're not seeing the kind of twilight of his leadership. I do wonder, and I end the book with this kind of open question of what it will look like after what I sincerely hope will be Ukraine's victory in this war. You have to imagine, what kind of difficult position Ukraine will be in. Even after the victory, its infrastructure will be largely destroyed. The economy will be in tough shape. You'll have millions of refugees returning home, needing a functioning economy, needing schools for their kids to go to. You'll have at least 1 million military servicemen and women coming home, needing psychological support, medical support, also economic and financial support. It's a very volatile political situation, and it'll be a very fraught transition to the post-war period, and a major test for Zelensky and for Ukraine as a nation. And we'll have to see how Zelensky will handle that, but it will require essentially a new transformation in him to a kind of post-war president, which will be no less difficult than the transformation he's undergone in the last 2 years.
Absolutely.